The 1960s was a time of incredible change, cultural revolutions, space exploration, and music that shaped generations to come. But for those who lived through it, it's the little things that stand out the most. Do you remember the crackling sound of vinyl records spinning, the excitement of watching Neil Armstrong's first steps on the moon, or the feel of your first bell-bottom jeans? It wasn't just an era, it was an experience, a time when everything felt possible. If you grew up in the 1960s, you're sure to remember these iconic moments that shaped your life forever. The music that defined a generation. One of the most memorable aspects of the 1960s was the music. This was the decade of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, and Motown. Whether you were twisting to Chubby Checker or getting lost in the psychedelic sounds of Jimi Hendrix, the music of the 60s was more than just entertainment. It was a movement. The songs told stories of love, rebellion, and the quest for peace. If you grew up in the 60s, you probably remember gathering around a record player with friends, letting the lyrics speak to your soul. Do you still remember the first time you heard Hey Jude or Satisfaction? Those songs weren't just hits. They were the anthems of your youth. TV shows that brought families together. The 1960s were also a golden age for television. Families would gather around the TV to watch their favorite shows, often with TV trays filled with dinner in front of them. Shows like The Andy Griffith Show, I Dream of Jeannie, and The Twilight Zone kept audiences entertained, while Star Trek boldly went where no TV show had gone before. Saturday mornings meant cartoons, and after school, you couldn't wait to watch Gilligan's Island or Bewitched. These weren't just shows, they were moments that connected families and gave everyone something to talk about. Cars that ruled the roads. Remember the cars? If you grew up in the 60s, you might recall the sleek design of the Mustang, or maybe you cruised around in a VW Beetle or a Chevy Impala. Cars back then had a personality, and driving was more than just a way to get from point A to point B. It was an experience. The car culture was huge, with drive-in movies and cruising being favorite pastimes. You might even remember that iconic scene in American Graffiti, a film that captured the spirit of the 1960s love affair with the open road. Toys and games that filled your childhood. What about the toys? If you grew up in the 1960s, you might have fond memories of playing with Etch-a-Sketch, Easy Bake Ovens, or G.I. Joe action figures. There were no smartphones or tablets back then, but there was plenty of fun to be had. You spent your afternoons outdoors with friends, riding bikes, playing hopscotch, or challenging your siblings to a game of Twister. Do you remember how exciting it was to get a new toy or game for Christmas or your birthday? Those simple joys were the highlights of childhood. The fashion that turned heads. Fashion in the 1960s was all about making a statement. The era began with classic, conservative styles and ended with bright colors, bold patterns, and a more relaxed, rebellious look. Women embraced the mod style with mini skirts and go-go boots, while men sported sleek suits and the ever-popular turtleneck. And who could forget the influence of the hippie movement? Tie-dye shirts, bell-bottoms, and love beads became staples of the counterculture revolution. Whether you were into the prim and proper look or embraced the bohemian vibes, the fashion of the 60s made sure you stood out. Cultural and political shifts. The 1960s were not just about fun and games. This was a decade marked by immense social and political change. The civil rights movement, led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., made a profound impact on the fight for equality in the United States. Meanwhile, the space race captured the imagination of millions as Neil Armstrong took that historic step onto the moon in 1969. The decade was also a time of protests, with young people speaking out against the Vietnam War. If you grew up in the 1960s, you were living through a time of revolution, where every headline seemed to be history in the making. If you're enjoying this walk down memory lane, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I love sharing these moments with you, and there's so much more to explore together. The moon landing, a moment that united the world. The 1960s were the era of the space race, and nothing captured the world's attention quite like the Apollo 11 mission. If you grew up in the 60s, you probably remember where you were on July 20th, 1969, when Neil Armstrong famously declared, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Families huddled around their televisions, watching grainy footage of the first humans walking on the moon. It wasn't just an American achievement. It felt like a victory for all of humanity. Do you remember the awe and excitement that filled the air that day? The power of radio. Before the dominance of television, radio was the go-to medium for news, music, and entertainment. If you grew up in the 60s, you probably spent countless hours listening to your favorite stations, whether it was tuning in for the top 40 hits or hearing breaking news events. Radios were in cars, kitchens, and bedrooms, and they connected people in a way that today's media can't quite match. Whether it was listening to the Supremes or catching a live broadcast of a sporting event, radio was an integral part of your daily life. Drive-in movies, the ultimate night out. Who could forget the joy of going to a drive-in movie? If you grew up in the 1960s, drive-ins were the perfect way to spend a weekend evening. You and your family would pile into the car, armed with blankets, snacks, and a sense of excitement. Watching movies under the stars became a favorite pastime, whether it was a romantic date or a family outing. Drive-ins captured the essence of the 60s, carefree, communal, and just a little bit magical. The Kennedy era. If you grew up in the 1960s, John F. Kennedy's presidency left a lasting impression on you. His charm, charisma, and vision for America inspired hope in a generation. From his famous inaugural speech, "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." To his tragic assassination in 1963, Kennedy's influence on the 60s cannot be overstated. The sadness and disbelief that followed his death were felt worldwide, and it marked a turning point in American history. Collecting baseball cards. For many kids growing up in the 1960s, baseball cards were more than just pieces of cardboard. They were treasures. You'd trade them with friends, collect your favorite players, and dream of completing the perfect set. Whether you were a fan of Mickey Mantle or Willie Mays, having their card in your collection felt like gold. The cards were often bought with a pack of gum, and opening a fresh pack to find a rare card was a thrilling moment. The rise of fast food. The 1960s saw the rise of fast food, with chains like McDonald's and Burger King starting to become household names. If you grew up in the 60s, you might remember the excitement of your first trip to a fast food restaurant. The idea of getting a burger, fries, and a soda in just a few minutes seemed revolutionary at the time. It was the beginning of a new era of convenience, and drive-through windows became a part of daily life. The influence of Woodstock. For those who came of age in the late 60s, Woodstock was more than just a music festival. It was a cultural milestone. Held in 1969, Woodstock brought together hundreds of thousands of people for 3 days of peace, love, and music. The performances by legendary artists like Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and The Who defined a generation and symbolized the counterculture movement. Even if you didn't attend, the spirit of Woodstock was everywhere, reflecting the changing attitudes of the time. JFK's Man on the Moon speech. Long before the Apollo 11 landing, President Kennedy made a bold promise in 1961 that America would land a man on the moon before the decade was out. His words inspired a generation of dreamers and scientists alike. If you grew up in the 60s, you may have found yourself looking up at the night sky, imagining the day when astronauts would touch the lunar surface. Kennedy's vision for space exploration was a beacon of hope and innovation during a time of uncertainty. Telephones with actual dials. Remember when phones had rotary dials? If you grew up in the 1960s, making a call involved carefully spinning a dial, one number at a time. Long-distance calls were a big deal, often reserved for special occasions due to the cost. And of course, there was no such thing as caller ID or voicemail. When the phone rang, you just picked it up, not knowing who would be on the other end. There was something exciting about that unpredictability. The Cold War and nuclear drills. If you grew up in the 1960s, the Cold War was a constant backdrop to your childhood. You might remember air raid drills at school, where you would have to crouch under desks or line up against walls in preparation for a possible nuclear attack. While it seems surreal now, the threat of nuclear war was very real back then. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world to the brink of conflict, and the tension was palpable. For many, those drills were a reminder of how uncertain the world felt during that time. Nostalgia and reflection. As we look back on the 1960s, it's impossible not to feel a wave of nostalgia. It was a simpler time in many ways, yet full of complexity and change. The memories of your childhood are probably filled with images of long summer days, neighborhood games, and the excitement of watching history unfold on a black and white TV screen. These memories are a part of who you are, and they have shaped your outlook on life. Each of these memories encapsulates a piece of the 1960s, a decade that left a deep impression on those who lived through it. If you enjoyed this, let us know in the comments about your favorite memories of the 1960s. See you in the next video.